In this tutorial, I will show you how the Terrain Tools add-on for Spline Architect works. How you can create mountains, paths, and more in a non-destructive workflow that works with Unity's built-in terrain system. First, create a terrain. The terrain has a minimum and maximum height range, and right now we are at the bottom, which means that we can't deform anything below the terrain. It's also very important to have raised the terrain when deforming splines on top of other splines, else you can get unwanted terrain buildup. To fix this, select the terrain GameObject in the hierarchy, right-click on the terrain component and raise the terrain by 10%. Now we are good to go. Create a spline. In the Spline Architect control panel, go to the Deform Terrain section. This is where most of the settings for how the spline deforms the terrain are located. Enable Terrain Deformation by pressing the Start Deforming button. Now the spline will automatically update the terrain when you move it or change any values. You can also adjust the terrain on individual control points. Select a control point, then press the terrain icon. Here you can scale, rotate, apply saddle skew and more. Let's create a mountain. Increase the blend width so the mountain gets a proper size. Next, add a noise layer. We have 8 different noise types to choose from. FMB noise and hybrid multifractal noise works best for mountains. Increase the scale. You can also adjust the noise erosion value. Now we have something that looks like a mountain. Next, let's make a path. But there is a problem. If we update the mountain, the path will disappear. To fix this, the path spline needs a higher layer value than the mountain spline. Splines with a higher layer value will always be applied on top of lower ones. Create a second path. And set this layer value higher than the first path. Now it will update correctly. If 2 splines have the same layer value, the last one you deform will appear on top. You can also parent the path splines to the mountain spline. Now when you move the mountain, all paths will move with it. Since Spline Architect works with Unity's terrain system, you can use the stamp feature to stamp a mountain and then deform paths along it. Here we have 2 intersections where multiple splines deform uneven terrain. Because of that, there is an issue. One intersection looks correct, while the other does not. If we move the incorrect intersection, it fixes itself, but then the other one becomes incorrect. And if we move that one, the first breaks again, and this keeps repeating. So how do we fix this? The easiest way is to use Unity's Set Height tool and create a flat base around the intersection. But we can also solve this in a non-destructive way, which makes it easier to edit later. Create a new spline and parent it to the intersection mesh. Use this spline as the base and set its layer value to 0. Then set all other splines to a higher layer. Now you can move both intersections and they will stay correct. Depending on your use case, you might also need to trim the end of the spline that's connected to the intersection and also reduce the scale for the width and blend width on the control point connected to the intersection. Another useful thing to know is what happens when you raise or lower the terrain directly on a spline. The spline will automatically correct itself so it stays on top of any changes made with Unity's terrain tools. You can't change the spline's terrain width because it will always correct itself, but you can change the blend width. For example, if you raise the terrain on the side of the spline, you can see that after the spline updates, the terrain is raised along with it. Also remember that any changes you make with Unity's terrain tools around splines will affect the base layer. If you paint on the spline and then press stop deforming, you can see that the terrain has been raised underneath it in the base layer. If you want to raise or lower the terrain without the spline correcting itself, you can press the bake button on the spline. This will apply the spline changes directly to the base layer, but it will remove the non-destructive workflow. Now I will show you how to use the Paint Terrain feature in Spline Architect. First, go to the Paint Terrain section on the spline. Here you will see a warning icon saying that no terrain layers are assigned. So the first step is to assign terrain layers to the terrain. Select the terrain game object in the hierarchy. In the terrain component, go to the Paint Terrain section. Set the active tool to paint textures. Then press Edit Terrain Layers and add a layer. If you are using multiple terrains, make sure they all have the same terrain layers in the same order. Now let's paint the path. Go back to the spline menu and open the Paint Terrain section and press Create Layer. You can have up to 16 paint layers on a single spline. The order matters, and the layers are painted from top to bottom. Next, choose a texture in the layer option. Increase the width and blend width, then press Paint. If you undo this, we can also add a noise to the paint. Go to the Noise section on the spline and press Create Layer. Then increase the noise scale. You can now see that the noise also affects the terrain deformation. If you want to remove that effect, set the noise group to none. Then go back to the Paint Terrain section and set Blend Noise to A. This applies the noise only to the blend width, which gives more texture variation. Press Paint again. Now we also want to paint the mountain. Add a paint layer just like before. This time adjust the slope value and the slope blend value. Then press Paint. For more variation, add another paint layer. On this layer, use a small slope range to create an outline around the cliff texture. Then press Paint. And now to the last and shortest part of this tutorial. Instantiating GameObjects along splines. Go to the Instantiate GameObjects section on the spline and create a layer. You can have up to 16 layers on each spline. Now we add 3 prefabs to the instance fields. then increase the offset splines value. This value determines how close instantiations can be to other splines. And in this case, we don't want any trees on the path carved along the mountain. Next, increase the width, spacing, apply random rotation on the y-axis, and increase the random scale value. Then press Instantiate. But we only want to spawn trees on less steep areas, so adjust the slope setting. Then press Instantiate again. That's all for this tutorial. Now you can create entire worlds by only using splines. Thank you for watching.